So what do we do? So what will this workshop be a little bit more precisely about? This is like the thing we are working with, the example we are working with, the very good semi-final. It's like one of the best, some of the best debaters of the world are in there. What we can learn from them is convincing argumentation. And what does that mean? Or convincing speech, basically. So what does that mean? So
try and see if you can get the front lights off so you can see that.
Maybe.
Yeah,
That's better.
Yeah.
So the aim of speech is to convince the audience, but there are several elements you need in order to be convincing, in a sense. Like, one big part of it, and this is something we're not going to deal with that, is the entire manner idea. So that the way you stand in front of the body of the audience, and how people look at you, your entire body language and stuff like that. Something we do not want to cancel out, like something we want to cancel out in this workshop, but it's definitely a part of speech. You need to be aware of this. Then comes the meta part, basically, what do you say? And also in the meta part, there are many things that are not necessarily logical arguments. You will have examples in your speech that just help illustrating what you were saying. Sometimes you will make a joke just to make sure that the listeners wake up, basically. Sometimes you will throw in interesting facts that are not arguments at all, just to paint the context you're talking of. For example, when you make an argument on specific situations in certain countries, you will very often have speeches that only consist to 50% of arguments, and the other 40%, then there are 40% facts and like 1%, 10% examples, just to build the context for the actual arguments you make. What we are going to deal with in this workshop, though, is just the logical part, the actual argumentation, the actual a part where we try to convince the listener of what we are saying, or tell him that what we do is either good or bad. So. You got a transcript, by the way, that will help you for pass along. So this workshop has actually 6 chapters. We'll first deal with the main principle, with the main idea of argumentation, and that is to get the listener agree with your stance. Then we will try to define what an argument actually is, because like currently I'm using the term without telling you what I actually mean when I say this is what is an argument. Thirdly, we will deal with analysis, and analysis is kind of a vague term, but is also the dark art that stands behind every argument and gets that stands behind every argument and makes it logical, and is in the end like the fundament you build your argument upon to get the listener to agree with you. And then we will deal with assumptions and how to assess them. And lastly, there will be the adjudication part I already talked about. So, first, agreement. The aim of making an argument is usually to get the person who listens to you to agree with you. So, you have a stance, and you want those who sit in the audience or who listen to you to at least be, well, if not like come completely on your side, at least be more informed about why it would be a good idea to come on your side. So how does this in principle work? The way we do this, we always need a starting point. So logical argumentation is very much like taxi driving. You need to pick those listeners that sit in your audience, you need to pick them somewhere up, and then you need to get them to your stance. So when we look at the audience as a speaker, we need to know that the listeners, or be it the judges in the debate, everyone, has a certain set of values, has a certain framework of assumptions that person works with. So for example, very many people will agree with you that war is a bad thing. Most people will agree with you that feeling uncomfortable is a very bad thing. And on the other hand, they will think, well, self-determination is a very good thing, fairness, good thing, things like that. This is where you can, these values already exist in the listeners, and they come through their lives to get the done thing. There are very basic versions of that, like probably every person on earth will agree with you that feeling uncomfortable is a very bad thing. On the other hand, there are also very sophisticated assumptions. Like, I think there's quite a couple of people out there that would agree with you that democracy is a good thing, but not necessarily all people would agree with you that this is the case. So you need to know that there is like different starting points. So, and the aim of the logical argument basically is very simple. It's a link between you agree with this certain assumption, with that certain premise. If you agree with that premise, you're on my side. So as a speaker, what you try in a logical argument is to find something the listener really agree with, the listener finds really important, and tell him, well, if you agree with that, you also agree with me. This is the link that we call an argument. This is the link that we call, or that leads to the agreement with your stance, that leads, or that helps you achieving the purpose of your speech. Well, yeah, in my example, I took out, war and fairness. Like, we, obviously in the kids, something very positive. You can make this in a positive way. You can take out things where most listeners would agree with you that this is something positive and tell them, well, if they are for that, they are for your side. Or take something negative, like if they are against that, they are on your side. This is what you're actually trying if you make a speech. Think about it. You will probably notice that when you argue with somebody else, that when you try to get that person on your side, you will very often try to find something that person agrees with or finds very important, and try to sell to that person that if that person agrees with that, he or she is on your side. And this is exactly how convincing speech, how argumentation works. So what is that thing we call, like I already hinted at, we now have something we can deal with in terms of arguments. We know what arguments are for. Arguments are those pieces of speech that make the link between an assumption and your stance. This is a very, very basic definition, and it's a very general definition also. Like every argument will somehow do this. If an argument is for or against one side, it will always have a starting point, and it will always link to a very to your stance or the thing it should be proposing at the very end. Is this clear to everyone? Like, if you have any questions, just raise your hand and stuff. Does that make sense? So, in this debate, in the debate we had just as an example, we heard that, it started opening government. We heard the first argument. What they say is that they want to ban sexually arousing images because they do not want to have you feel uncomfortable. So how is the argument working in that sense? What is the premise? What is the starting point? And what is the end point? Yeah, Damita?
The starting point is that the people don't like being uncomfortable, and the end point is that if they don't want to be uncomfortable, then...
Exactly. Exactly. So what we see, if we think like that in terms of arguments, you will see that this is exactly what these very good speakers in this one debate we talked to do. Like on the prop side, they try on the one hand tell you, like, if you don't like feeling uncomfortable, come on our side. Or if you don't like, how do you call it? Yeah, well, here I took the commercial incentives. So somewhere else in the speech there, actually in the second speech. If you don't like corporations to influence what we are thinking, then come on my side. This is what they tell us in their speeches, and this is how they are trying to convince us. Whereas the opposition tries to twist it and then says, well, if you don't like feeling uncomfortable, well, come on our side. So we can see we can see how this battle of arguments works. So Richard, I have a transcript for you of this. Oh, you already got one? Awesome. Yeah. So you will, if you notice, you won't have much trouble reading through the speeches and find exactly the places where they start and end with the argumentation. You will notice that they're very often at the very beginning and at the very end of their paragraph, so it's pretty handy, very easy to see if you walk through. Good. So, we know what an argument is, right? Or does anybody not know what an argument is right now? Any questions on the argument?
What is an argument?
No, that's a stupid question. Come on, no. Because it's good if you don't have any questions, because that means you can walk on and not waste your time. Good. We are all on the same page. That's very good. Next thing I will deal with is analysis. Who of you has already gotten the feedback he or she needs more analysis in his or her speech? Well, I would say that's the majority.
Too much analysis.
Okay, too much. You got too much analysis. Okay, good. Any ideas what analysis could mean? Like we know now we know what an argument is, right? But what could analysis mean? Like seriously, that kind of term. Well, what could it mean? Or what could judges mean with it? Yeah.
How do you come to this conclusion?
Okay, that's a very good point. So the logical part, yes. Any other ideas, Leo?
I just want to use your own wording, the links that prove our stance.
Okay, the links, yeah. Yeah, Andreas.
Evidence that something you say is true.
Evidence, okay. Explanation, very good.
Well, reasonably convincing links,
Yeah.
often supported by examples or analogies or all kinds of tools.
Okay. Very good. Like basically, analysis means all of that, all of these things. It is exactly like the fundament the argument is built upon. So the way you try to link your stance to, at least that's how I will use the term in this workshop. So we had another workshop with Harish. He actually said he actually came up with quite a narrow definition of analysis. You can look up the workshop on our resources page, by the way. He says, well, there's the 4 aims of analysis. One of them is the clear explanation of an argument. Secondly, it's the like the link from the beginning to an outcome. Thirdly, it's explaining why the outcome of an argument or of a policy, because he talked about first prop, is good or bad. And fourthly, it's making the argument important in debate. So you see, this is exactly all of these things. It's the tool set you need in order to make your argument convincing, or in order to actually make the argument, and not just make in comparison to just making a claim and have the listeners like guess whether it's true or not. Good. There are 2 green ones up there. The only reason I marked them green is because this is kind of what I will be talking about. Like I will narrow the word analysis down a little, just for the purpose of that workshop, and that's most kind of that very logical part. So explaining how the outcome occurs and explaining how something is good or bad. So if we have to illustrate this entire thing, it's like way from the logical, I think. If we have a logical argument, the analysis, well, should be like the main part in it, of course. But there is also other elements to that. So I would say, for example, that it's not enough to make, like in a debate, it will be not enough to like have good analysis and explaining your argument well. It will also you will also hear that you need more engagement, which means your argument needs to deal with the other side. You will also hear that you need a better framing, which basically means you need a better packaging of what you're saying. So there are also other elements, but let's deal with the analysis part. I would say it's the most important part, because as soon as you are able to make a convincing argument, as soon as you have to write analysis to do that, as soon as you're able to capable of that, it's easy just to add the other things that make that argument more convincing. So basically, if you have the present, it's way easier to package it than the other way around, right? You're not. It's pretty hard to get the birthday present in if you only have the packaging ready. This is the way it works. Good. In this, as I said, I narrowed analysis down a little bit. Let's go into a little bit more detail in terms of analysis. When we analyze these speeches, and when we think through how the speaker think and trying to get us on our side, we will notice that they actually do two different things that have to do with logical with logical analysis. Well, first of all, they will be they're doing a lot of claims, right? They claim objectification is bad. They claim, well, feeling uncomfortable is bad. And on the other hand, they add explanations and links. They try to make the logical causality between being uncomfortable and another assumption that then leads to another assumption. So this is what we call, or this is what I will call in this very workshop, raw analysis. So basically, you should understand it's some kind of an explanation to have the claim making more sense to the listener, or like of trying to put the string from one premise to the next premise, like these very little links, whereas it is of course as important to explain where you're starting from. Okay, so how does this work? How does this work in the actual speech? This is out of the opening opposition speech. So we find it somewhere at line number, I don't know, I think it's somewhere, yeah, somewhere at 161, I think. Somewhere there. We notice that the speaker starts talking about religion, trying to convince us that freedom of speech, or freedom of expression, as we would call it in Europe, is so important. So the first thing she does is she just explains what it means. If we think about that, if she just let that stand, like just explaining freedom of expression is like what it means, and saying, well, if you're against freedom of or if you're for freedom of expression, then you're on our side. That would mean, as a listener, we would very strongly need to agree that freedom of expression is a very good thing, right? Otherwise, that entire speech wouldn't, or this entire piece wouldn't make sense. Therefore, she goes on explaining us why freedom of expression is so important. Can, for example, see that she tries to very specific add on how, in this certain case, well, sexuality can be better expressed if you have like this openness around that they talk so much about in this one debate. I think if you read the line 161 to 179, you will have the word, there's a lot about public sexuality, different sorts of, and comparisons. This is trying to make this very difficult link from that very general concept of freedom of expression, very few people of us would agree with this, that this is something very absolute, to that very specific thing, like to that very specific assumption that that it is something important to have sexuality in public. So how does this look a little bit more precisely? This is taken out of the speech. Can very much see how it works, right? Like, first, it's a very general claim she makes, with implying that this would be analogous, and then she's explaining why that concept she's talking of is so important. And what we can see is that she's not doing that like, say, with just claims only. She's very much trying to illustrate a link between different things. First it's the link between freedom of expression and identity. You can see that is the first thing. Then it goes down between to identity and being able to challenge your identity in different identities. And with that, of course, this is something too easy to agree with, right? Like, freedom of expression is a vague concept, but your identity is something that's very close to you. That is something like most people would view as something very important. This is why why in this speech, this is the aim of the analysis in this speech, to make this entire concept important and get you to agree with her that this concept is important and should be applying in that. And in the second point, we see that then she draws the link to the actual stance. First, it's just an assumption, right? Public sexuality is different than private sexuality. It's a claim. But you need the raw analysis to explain that in order to make that entire argument important, or to make that entire argument credible and cause it. I mean, you could paint the colors probably a little bit differently as well. But does this make sense? That you always have the claims and you need the explanations basically to glue them together?
So the red is the analysis?
Well, the red is the raw analysis that glues those claims together, basically. So you have different claims, right? On the one hand, you start with that claim that freedom of expression is important. Then you go down to that claim that identity is important. Like, that's a lot more basic than freedom of expression, right? And what you have in between is a link, and that's what you also need for analysis. Both of them are part of analysis, but there are two different types. Like, one of them is going deeper, making those claims, and the second one is linking those claims, trying to find examples how different things play together. We can, for example, see in the second part very much how you have this example, or how in the red part she very much tries to find an example on how that claim she makes that there's different forms of sexuality is very important. Okay, got another example for you. So we start at the beginning. We see if that's something. I think that's at. You can read that down on your notes. That's line 200. If somebody wants to read it on his or her notes. What we see is at the very start there's a very general assumption, right? We want that. That's a very general concept. We want to allow for alternative conceptions of sexuality. Then she goes on explaining that. Then she goes into a very, very concrete example, and that is something she needs to draw the link to challenging, to being able to challenging your values, to being able to challenging your sexuality, because the debate is about sexuality. Can you see that? How that example makes it credible for you that challenging your values has something to do with these alternative conceptions in public? It's that one example that ties those two things together, because otherwise it wouldn't make much sense, right? You say, well, we need alternative conceptions because we want people to be able to challenge their values, their identities, things like that. This would be just two different claims. But what we see is that there's a lot of, the red part in it is very much that what makes these two things, what links these two things together. In that case, it's an analogy example. Any questions on that? Any opinions on that? Yes?
But the government is stating that the problem is that in advertisement you have just one role of sexuality, and she is now doing exactly the different and says that this opening.
Exactly. We'll go to that a little bit later. That's very well recognized. Yes, in comparing the arguments, we'll go to that. But do you get what I mean with analysis? Why it's so important? It's basically analysis. Basically, or what I want to get to you is that it's very important explaining stuff, especially your assumptions and how one assumption leads to another assumption. This is exactly what these two things of analysis do. So in this kind, the links and the raw analysis. Okay, so that was the most complex part of this entire workshop. I hope. So if you have questions on that, you can also feel free to ask, and I can also add some explanations later. But I will go into the next point, and it's already the fourth of that workshop, which is very handy. Assumptions. I talked a lot about assumptions just recently. So this is exactly what I indicated earlier, right? What the speakers are trying to do is get you from the very general concept to something that is very close to you, that is something that's very immediate to you, something that you're very likely to agree with. So we go from a very general assumption, like freedom of expression should not be violated. This is basically the assumption we have in line 1601 161. To we don't want people to feel ashamed. This is what we have in line 166. So these three lines of speech are basically just there to convince you that this very general concept, to convince is the wrong word, but to bring the basic assumption of the entire argument down from that very general concept of freedom of expression to that very basic thing of just not wanting to feel ashamed. And that's very handy for us as listeners, right? Because if we get something like we do not want to feel ashamed, if we get something like we do not want people to die, that's something we have very often in debate, or we do not want people to starve or something like that, or it's the same thing. Forget that. That's something it's very easy to agree with. But these, on the other hand, like a very general assumption, something like freedom of expression, like this is something many people would agree with, yes, but also many people would disagree with it. Or many people would say, yes, freedom of expression is important in certain circumstances. Freedom of expression, and they will still need to be convinced, right, that this is one of the circumstances where it is important. Hello. So what we notice is, I have a transcript for you to work with. So, what I previously talked about was very much about how an argument works, right? Now we can, if we identify the assumptions behind an argument, we can also see what makes a better argument, or what makes an argument work better, and what makes an argument work worse. So if we have a very, very basic concept behind an argument, if we have something, like shame, feeling uncomfortable, this makes a very strong argument, because you will have everyone on your side. But if you start at with a very complex assumption, then you will have the problem that the listener that doesn't agree with that assumption won't agree with you. Someone like this, but if we in this speech only had the line 161 that said, well, it violates freedom of expression and therefore it's bad, then you would, as a speaker, you would only have these judges on your side, or you would only have these listeners on your side that agree with you that freedom of expression is something fundamentally important. On the other hand, you need to see that, well, just in this debate, they just got an explanation why freedom of expression might not be that important, and just in general life, like most people will not be sure whether freedom of expression is something very important because it's just very hard to grasp, right? So the assumptions an argument are based upon are very important, and they can change entire debates. Who of you saw the Freshers Final, for example? Yeah. Okay, some of you. Anyways, it's of course most of you who started debating don't explain their assumptions too well and don't go down too much. But what the main problem we had with judging that final was that one side was starting that we had very, very high or very complicated assumptions. Like, for example, the closing prop case in that entire debate was based on the assumption that the shift to using more intelligence would be practical for a shift to soft power, which is an example some people may agree with, like all the other teams said this as well, which is an example some people may agree with, which is an example some people might disagree with. And as a debater, this is very dangerous. Well, it's also really dangerous in real life because, well, that means those judges who agree with that assumption, they are on your side, right? But the others are not, which basically means you will end up in a very, very long discussion what comes out of it, which is exactly what happened. Madeleine can, well, which Madeleine can very much agree, like, it was the same for all teams, so it didn't really matter. But which Madeleine can very much agree probably that this was the case in that specific case I was talking of. The point is, the point is, you can make an argument. The stronger, the more basic you go with your assumptions. So the deeper you explain something, the more you show that your argument works in real, or that your stance is really improves the life of a citizen, or it improves the life of the listener to a very, very low and on a very, very low and basic scale. This is something that makes your argument important, or this is something that makes your argument really strong. So what we can take out of these speeches, out of these very, very good speakers is their assumptions are really universal and basic, right? Like, feeling uncomfortable, is this something, like, would anybody of you, can you imagine anybody who says feeling uncomfortable is a good thing? Or making people feel uncomfortable is a good thing? Despite Leo, but he is a very rare species. You? No.
I would only argue for it in some cases.
Okay.
I would never say that it's a good thing, but I can imagine someone arguing that it would be a necessary thing for the greater good, so to speak.
Okay.
Yeah, same with if you make mistakes, most of the people would say it's bad, but then you can always argue.
But generally it's very, very basic, right? Compared to freedom of expression, that's something, is that easier to say that we, like, or is that something you would agree with more or less?
Less.
Yeah. It's less obvious, right?
If I was making a comparison between two scenarios, and I was saying sometimes feeling uncomfortable is bad, and I was saying sometimes freedom of expression is bad, which is more common, which is easier for me to express.
Exactly.
Common when it is.
Yeah, and Andreas?
The thing that bugs me about this is that it sounds less like, a logical argument and more like an attempt at emotional manipulation.
No.
To some extent it is. I'm not going to
No. I can tell you why it's logical. Because we are working, like, the more we work with assumptions and the more we work with very basic assumptions, the more we do that, analysis means that we show the effects of a policy down to the real life of some people. Like, as long as we stay on those very general assumptions, right? Like freedom of expression, I don't know, feminism, all those buzzwords. As long as we stay on that level, it's very much an emotional thing. Yes, because we want to get those people who have a very strong attachment to those very general values on our side, and therefore we probably need to work with emotions because these are very general and vague concepts. But the more we go into deeper assumptions, into real life, this entire thing is a logical game. Because if you want to show that the policy leads to people feeling more comfortable or uncomfortable, you need to show that the effect of how this policy will affect their real lives, how this will go, how will that impact their daily lives, how will be the changes that they need to face if we change this very policy. And this is something that is very much logical, and this is the aim of logical, this is the beauty behind logical analysis, because it means that you are not like just appealing to some vague concept, that you're actually trying to find out what does a certain stance, or what does a certain like stance is the wrong word, but what does a certain motion mean if it's implemented to everyone, to a certain group of people, to different groups of people, and why is it a good or a bad thing? So this is a very much a logical thing. Or do you disagree with that?
The thing I disagree with is that, okay, if we talk about general concepts, like, okay, we are going to violate the human rights declaration, is something else than if you say, and concretely, if you go down in the analysis, babies and puppies are going to die. You know, this is you might use logical steps to get to that conclusion, but the conclusion is one that is much more emotional and creates a much more emotional response than your abstract buzzword. And so while you might use logic to get to that your goal is an emotional one.
I wouldn't think so. Like avoiding dead people, like even if it might have some some emotional attachment, is still something that we would consider important for a reason, right? The same is feeling comfortable in our daily lives. If we can improve the lives of citizens or something like that, this is, of course, there's an emotional thing behind that, but it's very much something we would like to achieve. Whereas if you're appealing to a vague concept and like the actual effects on the actual lives are unclear, then I would say this is more emotional, because it doesn't work with something. It doesn't work with things that we could actually imagine, with things that we could actually feel in real life. Yeah.
I think you could even say that it doesn't matter what the origin of those claims are, because you can never like ultimately finally prove that like killing is bad or that anything is good or bad, and whether it's because of emotion or whatever you feel that this is true, you just have to make the link, I think.
Yeah.
Can I contribute on that?
Yeah.
I'm going to disagree with you now.
Okay.
I'm going to say this, right? Any concept that we come across, either we don't understand it, in which case we can't talk about it because we don't know what we're saying, or we define it to clarify the concept, at which point the very definition gives it a framework, a set of criteria by which we assess what is and isn't a part of that concept.
Okay.
Even when we talk about good and bad, they have a definition of what they mean, and the definition itself categorizes what will and won't be included with that.
Okay. Well, let's stop that kind of discussion. Sorry.
The assumption. Please a second, one second. The assumption that Stefan and Andreas are making is what's known as the Balkan fallacy, the straw Balkan fallacy, which basically assumes that logic is devoid from emotion. Emotions are the tools that we use to assess what is good and bad, what is harmful and non-harmful. Right? When we say hurting kittens is bad, we say that because we empathize with those kittens feeling pain, and we know that what it feels like to us to feel pain, and that link of feeling pain makes us realize that that kind of sensation is a bad. Okay?
So
it is based on emotion, but it's also based on the definition of what it means to be good or bad, or harmful or non-harmful.
yeah, like this is actually something where I would agree with Leo. So I think the easiest way to think about this is that we are all human, that we are all in some kind of very similar, right? Experience similar things. And therefore there's some values that, well, they might not be completely universal, but at least like where most people would agree with you, and where we also like aim as entire humanity to achieve them, like less dead people or something like that. This is really, really basic. Like it's emotional, yes, but it's also like kind of logical that all people want to have that. You cannot tear these two things apart. So, but what you need to take away from this workshop, so this was a philosophical part of it, right? But what you need to take away from this workshop, what this entire thing with the assumptions means, basically, the better you explain things, the deeper you explain things, and the better you show the effects of your policy to real life, that will mean that judges will be more likely to agree with you, or anyone will be more likely to agree with you. With other words, your speech becomes more effective, or how the British would say, it becomes more persuasive. Good. In a debate context, like, okay, I called it credibility, it's probably not the best way, but how we judge these assumptions is a little bit, well, it's probably not all too different from real life, but that's like, make a gap here for, well, this is a little bit more debate-ish than just general argumentation. If we judge and assess arguments, or assess when an argument is good, we very often do not need to judge when an assumption is right or not, because very often we have the assumption in the debate, like the other side agrees with that, or it comes up and is just conceded. On the other hand, what we judge generally, or what we do when we use the debate, we very often try to use just common sense. So we don't think about philosophical concepts too much, we just think about common sense. Like, would most people, would a reasonable person see that assumption as true or not? Again, the more basic it is, the better it is. So if you think about the audience, now you know that the red dead babies one, and the feeling uncomfortable ones, like it's not just like different there, that there's also hierarchy between them, that you can also say, well, most people would say dead babies are worse than just feeling uncomfortable sometimes. And inequality is probably less important than feeling, well, it's probably less important than feeling uncomfortable or avoiding war. So that's what you take out of the assumptions part. Good. Any questions on the assumptions? It's difficult, right? Or not so easy to understand. Well, yeah, that's why it's an interesting concept. If it would be easy, it wouldn't be fun. Pardon?
You wouldn't need us.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. you wouldn't need to train debating to be good at it. But unfortunately, this is something though. Like, if anybody of you does research or is in science, this entire thing with the assumptions is actually pretty similar. If you know that, like, the more basic your assumption, like, usually the better your concept is. It's funny that logical argumentation works on kind of the same way, or like probably logical argumentation was there before. So science works the same way as logical argumentation, I would say.
Science is just a methodology that uses
yeah, exactly.
to prove its point.
So yeah, so this entire concept of assumptions, and so it should sound not entirely new to you if you've already done research science stuff. It's pretty similar concepts. Okay, now to the more fun stuff. We're now the theory. Now we have kind of the most basic theory we need to know for having a good speech, and we kind of know what an argument is. We know what an analysis should be and what it's aiming to achieve. Also, we know what makes analysis stronger, right? We noticed that it makes that stronger further the more basic assumption behind it. So the cool thing is now, if we know these things, we can assess arguments without just using like our gut feeling. We can go and think and say, well, one argument is better than the other because, and not just because you feel so. This is what this part of this entire workshop will be about. Assessing arguments, yay! Good. First one should be very easy. That's what we already talked about, right? Talked about it way too much in the past 15 minutes. Assumptions, and the deeper you go on, how credible they are. This is what I would call the depth of an argument. The deeper you explain one argument, the more, like, the stronger it gets in one direction. Yes, question?
Well, you have 7 minutes, right? Is it more important to, I mean, what if, like, say you have 4 arguments, right? And
Yes, yes, and that's actually
Talk fast.
yeah, like that's one of the reasons why I took these speeches here. If you read through them, you will notice there are two things that stick out. Like first of all, they are very structured, doing exactly that, going deeper in the argumentation. Secondly, they are very fast at doing that. And if you listen to them, you will notice they also talk really fast. So I would say the better the speaker is, the better he will be able to do that. Like you can never see a horizon in that, so that it will always be a way to do it better, right? So, but generally for a debate, I think you won't be able to explain an argument indefinitely anyways. Simply because it's intellectually really, really challenging to come with all those links and all those assumptions and all those raw analysis within those, I don't know, 3 minutes you have before your speech is like in a stage where it can actually be composed. So this is probably a question you will never need to, it's probably never a question you will need to answer how deep you can go, unless you're like really so good that you know you can show like everything from everywhere. But until then, I would say like, well, yeah, very much try to explain your arguments to the very end, or at least to a very, very basic level in order to get the audience to agree with you or get the other side to like not win that one. Good. Okay, so that's...
Summarize that. You have three options. Give half of them to your partner, discard them, talk fast.
Yes, and usually you do all three of them. So, no, like as a guideline, try to explain your arguments really, really good. What you also can take out of these speeches, how many arguments are they making in one speech? Two usually, yes, two. And these are very fast and good speakers. Oh yeah, does anybody, like I already told some of you, okay, those people do not need to answer, but can anybody of you guess how many words they speak in 7 minutes 20? Because I typed them all off, right? I know that. How many words are there in? Any guesses?
1,000.
1,000?
500 to 600.
500 to 600? Any other ideas? Come on, you cannot really be wrong there.
1,895.
Exactly.
The thing is that Andreas is actually the closest to that. I know that the Prime Minister's speech has approximately 1,500 words, and that's in 7 minutes and 11 seconds or so. 1,500 words, which is a lot. Like, or which is really impressive. For example, if you read through the speech of the deputy leader of the opposition, that speech is a little bit shorter. But if you read through it, it feels like it was written, typed off, and corrected because it's like very nicely done. And so these guys, they're basically doing 1,300, 1,500 words essays in form of a speech. Think that up within, I don't know, probably the last 5 minutes before they actually walk up, or like when they answer questions even less than that. So it's actually pretty amazing to do that. And the cool thing is, the more you do debating, the closer you can get to that level. So, yeah, in debate is very, as you can see this, like with the logical thing. So debate is very much an intellectual game to bring your assumptions very, very down, very much down on the one side. But there's also a second dimension to argumentation.
Maybe you shouldn't have written S.
Maybe think of a different abbreviation for assumption.
Yeah.
Should I? Should I? Wait a second.
Or A dot or something.
Did I screw it up? I can do that. If assumption.
It's still on camera, like.
Yeah. Like it didn't go through the equity check, obviously. So, is that better? Nice. Okay, so even those people who care about equity of yes. No, well, it's actually not assaulting anyone. It's a political correctness. So it's very, very American, this concept. So, anyways, there's a second dimension to argumentation, though. Because not everything they tell us that being uncomfortable, if you are uncomfortable, or if you don't like feeling uncomfortable, this means you agree with them. Not every single time they really make that in a way that we believe that, right? Like the second, as I told you, there's two dimensions, right? There is on the one hand the claims, what we always had in green, and on the other hand is making that link between a claim and your stance. So the second dimension to an argument is how strong it is made, in the sense that there is a concept that leads from the assumption you're working from to the stance. This is kind of a different skill, right? Like on the one hand, like to think how deep something goes, or to think of to make an argument deeper in a sense, or better explained in terms of depth, you need to be very creative. You need to find new ways how this argument affects people. You need to be very good at thinking up the mechanisms and lead it. And the second skill is, in order to make an argument strong, in order to make these links work, you need to be very good at drawing these links, these lines. So you need to be very good explaining mechanism and understanding how things play together. Any ideas where we can see that in this speech, for example? I think there's an example for a very, very weak link. On line 45 in the second sentence, for example, or line 45, for example, is a very good example for this. The lines are continuous, so it's in the first speech. Line 45, or before that, line 44, like this entire paragraph. Okay, yeah. Like, is that a very credible way to indicate why people feel uncomfortable about, I don't know, sexually arousing advertisements? Like, just because people have sex in private, it probably doesn't mean that they feel uncomfortable about
There's a pretty wide, like, between having sex and viewing pictures of people in bikinis.
Exactly. Because we are not even talking about pornography, right? We are talking about advertisements. We are talking about, like, what we are talking about is basically just, I don't know, like probably 95% of the advertisements you would see on the street. And then he's talking about, like, yeah, this is why people, and the analogy he's trying to use to make the link between feeling uncomfortable is, this is why people have sex in private, because they feel uncomfortable with sexuality. So you can see this is probably, like, even though this is Chris Pissett is a very, very good speaker, this is an example how the link between the assumption is very basic, right? But the link between the assumption and his stance, or what he is standing for, it's very shady, or at least not everyone would buy that, I would say, right? Or would agree with that he made that plausible. Can you see that? On the other hand, I think we have very, for example, like in the leader of the opening of the opposition, from line 378, it's an entire paragraph, unfortunately, so you would need to read through it. I think that's a very good example how you can make it, how you can make an explanation very, very credible, where he talks about objectification and then about how this is actually something very normal. And the way he does that is with a lot of real life examples and a lot of very, very basic examples actually. This is something we'll probably be very likely to believe. So it's very good raw analysis, or very, very strong argumentation, very strong, very good strength of the argument. So very hard to tackle that there's something might be wrong. Good. Yeah, I don't need that slide. Good. Is everyone done with reading, or do you still need a few minutes? It's like it's a little bit dark in here. It's probably better. You can still see everything. Just do not want anyone to fall asleep in that lecture. The guy gets sleepy if it's so dark. Lecturer asleep, that would be fun. Okay. Did anybody read through it? Did you find it good?
I'm not really sure about it. I mean, maybe it's new. I don't really understand the line that goes through it.
You understand? You don't understand the line? Okay.
Trying to explain that the red is the link. And how
No, there is no red and stuff in. Oh, you mean on that slide, or?
I mean the paragraph.
Okay.
Because he kind of goes from objectification to like.
Okay. Well, yeah, maybe then I just picked a bad example. Okay, but anyway, if it was a bad example, it means you see how these links, how this raw analysis often is not good enough, or often is not very convincing. Or this is a very hard thing to do. So, well, if you didn't see the line, then that probably means, like, of course, there's always some kind of judgment involved. Otherwise, I think, yeah, like the entire freedom of speech thing we talked about. Oh no. Line 119 is probably a better example, like the corporate incentives. That's something that makes a lot of sense. 119, yeah. The corporate incentives, they're... That makes sense, right?
Sorry, what?
Line 119, that para makes more sense, right? No, this is at least very, very logically done. This is, or that would, then sorry for my previous example. Then line 119, that would be a good example of how very logical way to analyze things. So, have we got it? More logical? Yeah, okay. Perfect. Well, now you have some good and bad examples, and mediocre example. Maybe I picked just the wrong place. Sorry for that. Okay, anyway, I think that slide should be clear. So in the end, we have like two ways to assess an argument, right? What we get out, what we showed just right now. On the one hand, we can say, well, the assumption behind an argument was just unrealistic, or was just way too complicated. Way too complicated. On the other hand, we can say, well, the argument was not well explained in the sense that the concept behind the argument didn't make sense, like, or that the link between the assumption and the stance wasn't clear. So the raw analysis lacked. This is the two dimensions you have. But if you're an adjudicator, that already makes you a very good adjudicator if you can distinguish between those two, because most people don't realize that there are different things that can make an argument weaker. I would say these are the most, like there are other things that make an argument weaker as well, or stronger, but these are very two elements on the logical part of an argument. So a great argument has a very, very basic assumption, or very, very universal assumption, and is a very, very logical flow from that assumption to what you want to achieve with that argument. Whereas a weak argument is quite the opposite. Good. Good news. This is the last part of the presentation. I hope you liked that fact. Yeah. Anyways.
Maybe one more.
Yeah. Like I think we can just add questions afterwards. That's what I plan to do. I really don't want to make this entire presentation longer than 1 hour and 30 minutes. Or at least that was my aim, and I'm currently at about. Well, okay, I'm not doing all too well.
We never finish early.
we never finish early, but we will be done by 9, I guess. So it's done. No, that's actually 1.5 hours. I'm actually doing pretty well. I'm exactly in time. Yeah. So. Good. So, in terms of adjudication, if that's too fast for anyone, right? If you have any questions on what was before, or if you're unhappy with my examples, which might be because even those speakers are not perfect. Yes, tell me this.
I just have a question which might not fit in here, but I don't really understand what the whole incentive argument is about. So.
Oh, you did.
Maybe you want to talk about that later.
No. We can very much do that. Like, because you mean line 119?
Yeah.
Okay, it's an answer to what the other side says.
About whether state versus corporation has a better incentive.
Yeah.
For regular. I don't understand.
Yeah.
What's better incentive?
Well, who is better equipped or capable at providing the right kind of image? Yeah,
That's not what incentive means. Incentive means like
well,
who has a bigger reason.
yeah, sure, the reason, but and that's kind of it. So if she's arguing that corporations have to answer to consumers in a way that is very adaptable. She's basically arguing free market will adjust to kind of.
Yeah, like the reason for that argument is that the previous speaker, I think it's line 79 or something like that, comes up and says, or the actual argument starts a little bit earlier, comes up and says, well, we need to regulate those images because they think the state is better suited at deciding what people should see than corporations, because corporations are utterly bad at doing that for A, B, C, D reasons. That's basically his argument. So she's countering that argument by saying, well, actually corporations don't have a bad incentive because they also want to have people feel uncomfortable. And he himself says in that entire debate before that the state is somehow better at doing that.
So by bad, they just mean immoral.
And
by good incentive, they just mean a moral incentive.
Exactly, yeah, like by his criterion, yeah, it's very much an example, like, because it's all about feeling comfortable, it's about an incentive that makes people feel comfortable in their daily lives. And that's why she says it's very much, corporations, yeah, actually have a good incentive to do that because they, well, want to appeal to people.
Yeah, I just wasn't clear on whether that meant
Yeah.
strong incentive or
No, that was related to the other speech, so that's very much the engagement part where she deals with the other side. But I think the way she does that is something that's very plausible, right? Like, you want to appeal to people, you probably don't make them feel uncomfortable.
But only because she explains her argument or her answer better than he does, because if she goes deeper and explains why the state has better
Incentives, exactly.
Then he would win this point in the first place, isn't it?
Exactly, and that's why I wanted you to get. Awesome. Because in judging and in adjudicating debates, we exactly do that. We try to find out who was better on the logical argument. So while adjudication is like, well, I told you that there are many elements about arguments, right? I told you that there is this framing part. I told you that there's this entire engagement part. I told you that there is all this selling stuff. The problem with most of these soft things is that they're very hard to compare. So the logical part, these arguments we're talking right now, and Richard had perfectly grasped the issue, is something we can compare really easily, because, or at least we can compare in a quite objective way. We do not need to take ourselves in very much into the debate to judge whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. So this is very important for adjudicating debates. So therefore, the actual criterion adjudicators take in debates to adjudicate or to find out who won is to ask the question, who has contributed the most in terms of winning the logical argument? At least that's how Sam Block formulated it for the Worlds 2012, and I think it's pretty much stayed the same. So how do we do that? As we've already noticed, we can compare arguments in terms of depth. We can compare them in terms of their strength, in terms of how strong their concept with links between an assumption and the stance. And well, we know that we have some other criterion aside, right? We know that there is not just the logical part, we know that there is a big manner part, we know that there is an engagement part, we know that there's framing. We know that there are other criterion as well that make an argument convincing. It's basically all we need to know in order to adjudicate a debate. Or not like anyone can adjudicate a debate in the sense of where do I feel I agree more with. But that's basically all we need to know in terms of adjudicating a debate in a more objective way, in a way where we can also justify why we think something is good or not. I think in terms of logical arguments, you will only encounter 3 cases in debates. The first case is that both arguments work very much on the same premise, but like both teams have something where they say, well, this is a very plausible thing, but we have come up with different concepts why somebody who is for that premise will need to be on either side, on either stance. So basically they have a very common aim, but very different ways to achieve that. Classical cookie cutter, already told you at the very beginning somewhere. That's something you will have very, very frequently. The second thing is, you will very often have that one team explains something, and the other team basically comes here and explains it even deeper. That's what we had just with the corporations incentives, right? Or even deeper and better, and basically therefore wins the issue or continues the issue. And that team that went the deepest will win that one. I called it here. It's both. It's also a clash, but I call it contentious issue just to make a differentiation here. Then there is a third case. That is where we have 2 different arguments that are somehow about the same topic, but that do not have the same premises, and that do not really engage with each other. That's what we call a messy debate, and that's what the most frequent case. Okay.
Frequent refreshers.
Well, those were, yes, they were very frequent and precious.
In every debate I heard the adjudicators say this was a messy debate.
Yes. So now you know what that means. That means that the teams, when they were making the arguments, they neither agreed on the same premise, and they neither continued their arguments from the further team to a deeper premise. So they didn't have the same, they didn't continue their concepts, and they didn't go deeper in their premises.
They didn't engage with the premises from the other team.
Exactly.
So there was very little to compare between them, and that means that it's left a lot more for the judges to assess which premises are more valid and why.
The problem with these kinds of debates is, and now because this is after freshers, I can be very honest with you. These kinds of debates, like the third case, and that's the reason why it's gray here, it will not come down to logical argumentation. It will very, very frequently be other criterion that we take to adjudicate the debate, like who had the nicest speeches, something like that, who had the arguments that made the most sense in and of self, who said the less nonsense. I was close to saying another word. Who has whom would we like to agree with, stuff like, or who just said the most the things that made sense, stuff like that. Okay, so these very messy debates are judgment calls, very difficult for adjudicators, and it's very frequent that you have one of these debates and 5 different calls, because it's very difficult to see who won this debate, because in the end nobody managed to do what logical argumentation actually should be about, to convince of one side more than of another, or to show how one side beats another. It's not a bad thing though if you're in a messy debate. They happen very frequently, and messy debates are the place where I learn in order to get to good debates. So it's the starting point. And even though the start is a little bit muddy for the adjudicators, it's luckily that's not your issue if you're the speaker in a messy debate, because you do not need to come up with a call and the justification afterwards. Yes. So I hope this didn't sound too harsh. What I want to make clear is that debates are like high-level debates are very intellectual, are an intellectual game of logical argumentation. This is not necessarily true for those debates, or it is not necessarily true if you start debating, but it's also not a problem because of course you need to start somewhere and then learn in order to become really good. But it's something. It's probably something that should be an incentive for you to be in debating really long, because the longer you are in debating, the better you get at this really cool intellectual assumption stuff. Yes.
So, okay, but what would you do if your opening government and opening opposition, for example, your closing opposition, did not provide any arguments that are, in your opinion, your personal opinion, relevant to the motion?
Well, it's not your fault. As in general, this will happen, and then it's not your fault if the entire debate doesn't make sense. Don't feel to be too responsible for how a debate goes. It's like, as I said, this is a world semi-final we are working with, and this is where we can see. This is even where we can still spot like how things are confusing, right? Like the meter found out, like, okay, this doesn't make sense. So it's incredible.
Do you engage with these arguments still?
Hmm?
Do you still engage with these arguments?
Yeah, it's a very general question that, like, Leo, if it's on that, I think we won't answer it to you.
I just want, because obviously you said that a lot of people will end up in messy debates, so how to deal with it, I think, is a little bit important. Only in the sense that what you want to achieve is basically, if you're the only one who wants to clarify the debate, clarify what assumptions they make, engage with their assumptions and tell us why they're wrong, clarify your assumptions and why they're good, and therefore you've got a clear debate and you easily win.
Yeah, like, I would say it's a little bit more difficult than that, right? Like, debating is not something debating is not something you learn from one day to another out of a book. There's a lot of implicit skills. There's a lot of thinking involved. Like, be honest, like thinking up stuff like that within a few minutes, this is like really, really, really hard job. And like, I'm not capable of doing that, and I still make a lot of errors, because this is pretty much like writing a scientific essay in the time of 7 minutes and delivering it at the same time, and answering questions and having all those claps and audience around you. So this is like incredible, okay? So the steps you go there, so there's a long way to get there, and at the very beginning is to get the tool right, to be comfortable with your own speech, because only if you're comfortable with your own speech, you will be able to deliver your thoughts and have a benefit if you improve your thinking behind that debate. And then the next step is finding out, like, getting a better grasp on the issue. That's the next step. If you're comfortable with your speeches, you will notice that now the challenge is to find those arguments which are really important in that, or to find the arguments which are actually important in the debate, or which are very close to that debate. That's where engagement will somehow start to play a role. As soon as you've got that, the next challenge will of course be to, if you have the arguments that are important, to make them in a way that they come across that are very convincing, because it's very hard actually to explain things. It's very hard actually to explain explain these concepts we have in the debates, because, well, they are sophisticated, and and be honest, it's quite far-fetched. Like in here, for example, like feeling uncomfortable in sexualized advertisements. This is like ages from each other. So you need explaining this concept is a very, very hard thing in the first place. And as soon as you learn that, you will have the next challenge that, like, as soon as you get your concepts across, you think up. You will have to. You will end up in rooms where the other teams start challenging your concepts, because only if they come across properly, the teams will engage, and the debates will be not that messy anymore. And this is then where it starts, that you need to make your concepts more stronger, that you need to go deeper in your analysis, that you need to go, or this is where it becomes really overwhelmingly important before that as well. And then after that comes probably that level, where in the world semi-final, I think about like how I probably would have needed another layer of analysis to win over the other teams, and then would have won world. So there's a very, very long way, but don't be afraid. Like you learn, debating teaches a lot of skills, and this logical argumentation thing is just one, and that it only becomes very apparent in the high-level debates. It doesn't mean you do not learn it in the low levels, or it doesn't mean you do not get it in the messy rooms, but only in the very top-notch debates it will be concentrated on this battlefield of logical argumentation, logical concepts, and assumptions. Does that make sense? It's a long road, but it's a very nice one.
Are you managing at all levels?
Yes, it's you learn very different things. I'm not at that level at all, right? But I went that way a little, and I noticed every single time you make the next step forward, there's a new challenge for you, and where you then and as soon as you approach that one, you can see again the horizon is not yet there, right? On the other hand, it means you get better at such a lot of things, and this entire logical argumentation thing. Even if you're in a messy room, even if the adjudication is not on that, you will still have adjudicators who understand it. You will still have adjudicators who will give you feedback on the arguments behind that, and you will still improve on that. But the actual adjudication just on that kind of logic, that is something you will have in finals, that is something you will have in star rooms, which you will see at Vienna IB, which you will see at Vienna EUDC, as wing judges probably, because that's where we get you in. And it's a pretty cool thing actually. Or you will see, or if you go to tournaments, that's where you will see that kind of level of debating. So, nevertheless, it's good to understand how the very high level, because that means you see the carrot at the end of the stick, right? Pardon? Oh yeah, you see, I dare say that tomorrow won't be the level of the world semi-final. I dare say that. No, I dare say that. Also like the ESL, if you watch the ESL finals, and let's skip that part. Anyways, you need to know that even though some debates are incredibly messy and otherwise, there is a beauty behind that becomes apparent in some very good debates. And that's another reason why we love this sport. Good. Back to comparing arguments. I think, no, Richard was actually in the second segment. Okay, first way to compare arguments. That's what you will need tomorrow, because we'll hopefully have one clash in that entire debate tomorrow. Probably Sabine will also be talking about, if you have very similar assumptions on both sides, you compare the strength of the analysis to that side. So, what we found out, right, at the beginning of this entire session, we draw up this entire idea of that the prop case was based on the assumption that we do not want to have people feel uncomfortable, whereas the other side says, well, people actually feel more uncomfortable or feel shame, which is actually not too far-fetched from feeling uncomfortable when the sexualized ads are removed from public. This is very practical because it means both sides actually want the same thing, right? They want to have people feel uncomfortable. And this means we do not need to make any judgment calls in terms of what is the premise of the debate, because both teams basically agreed that having people feeling uncomfortable is a bad thing, which is probably not too much of a big assumption. Nevertheless, it's very handy for us. So the only thing we need to compare if we have this case in terms of two arguments is what? Any ideas? What do we need, if they have the same assumption behind their cases, what do we need to compare? Very much the concept, how they get to their stance, right, from this very premise. And as I said to you, this might be not too difficult in this very example. On the one hand, on the one hand, we have the proposition which basically main justification is, well, people have sex in private, therefore it's something people feel uncomfortable with in sexualized ads. On the other hand, what we get is that it means, well, if we ban those things, we put away a certain part of people's identity because it's not able for them, but they will become unable to get exposed to things that might potentially challenge their identity, which is important for them to form that identity in the first place. So we can see that this explanation, like if we compare this to explanations, one is very, very basic and simple. The basic and simple one is in line 44, and the other one is in line 200. If you compare these two explanations, like I'll just give you a few minutes to reach the. Okay, are you through with it? So who has the more plausible we just do a show of hands, right? Who votes, who has the more plausible concept of how, how these advertisements do or do not make these people feel uncomfortable? Are you more, after you've seen those things in the speeches, are you more, do you think that more, are you more on the government side, which says like this entire thing about having sex in private means you're uncomfortable with sexuality, or do you think the identity part is stronger, and this entire capability of challenging your identities? Which one of them is probably the more plausible or more sophisticated explanation? So who is for the government side? Show of hands. 2, 3. Okay, who is for the opposition side? Okay. Yeah, very much. We didn't have a lot of disagreement here. Okay, so we see this is something that's actually not too hard. As soon as you have a common premise, comparing how this premise is being explained, you will get at least of course there's reasons to disagree in that specific case, and that will always be you will always be able to discuss things, but this is something you can compare pretty easily. As soon as you get some practice in adjudicating, this will also be very easy. Well, think about that tomorrow in the pro debate. You can then tell us who had a better concept. Yeah, Mark.
You know actually which teams won that?
I know it. Yeah. Opening opposition and closing government.
Obviously closing government.
Closing government. Like they were really good in that debate, but I don't know which person could transcribe their speeches. Like, they're so fast. Yeah.
I have a question. Like, when if you judge and they bring up argument, freedom of expression, and it leads to don't want to feel ashamed, is it like, okay, this argument I don't agree with, this is why I'm judging it, or is it because the way she brought it?
Well, no, don't, like, what do you think? If you're judging, you try to take yourself out of the debate, right? Like, you try to intervene not at all into the speeches. So what you basically think, if you have those two like, in that case, you think, like, we have heard these two concepts. Both of them have the same end, shame, or feeling uncomfortable. Which one of them is the more plausible? Whether it's called freedom of expression or something else, that's pretty, you just leave that aside. don't make any judgment on this. This is more a packaging thing, right? And then, yeah, and that's how you try to find that out. But as I said, like in this debate, I only showed you like parts of the entire speeches right now, or like only directly to them. And of course, this entire, like the way, there's a little bit more to being, let's say, yeah, like in this case, you will very easily make, like as you said, as you saw, like most people actually agreed that opposition had the stronger case, and most judges will have some practice and will be on a very similar ground. So this, in this debate, I knew the judging discussion because I knew a couple of the judges which were in there, and that's one of the reasons why I took this debate. I knew, for example, that that issue was exactly decided on these pieces of analysis and opening opposition one, and that's very much because they just had a way better concept of showing how their premise would lead to their that premise would lead to their stance than the other side. But you try to take yourself out, so you didn't think, okay, freedom of expression, I don't like that, I don't listen to the argument anymore. No, you think, you wait for the entire speech, and if the very basic of the speech is okay, you will just don't worry too much about it. Did that answer the question? Yeah. Kind of, or? Okay, well.
Yeah, because the problem is, if, for example, you say the grass is green, and you think no, because when, for example,
okay.
it's getting dirty or something like this.
Well,
but it's the way you see it, and this is like, you can, what is realistic?
Yeah, that's a problem, especially at worlds where you have like people from very different contexts. I think it's the speaker's problem though. So that's the reason why you have a judging panel, right? And you always get some kind of a majority vote and convincing arguments for each side. And what you try to find out is what would the average person think. But what happens in the end is, if you have 5 people in a judging panel, and they are more or less randomly picked from like all over the world, if it's worlds, or all over Europe, if it's yours, you will pretty much get a pretty accurate like view how this would convince, right? And you, as a speaker, you're never able to convince 100% of the audience. There will always be people who will say, freedom of speech, I hate that crap. Or in the US, you will always get, oh, you made this freedom of speech argument, I love it. Yeah, in the like US American judges are very much like that. You will always have this in the panels, but through the fact that you have like diversity in there, this somehow levels out, and you come kind of a middle ground, and the person who actually did the better job will win this debate, will have more on his or her side. So I hope that answered the question. Did it? That's good, that's good. Like that. Okay. The second way to compare arguments. Yeah, Richard, can you just repeat what you said before about this entire corporate incentive thing, because that was actually very clever.
I just said that the opening opposition argument just worked because they explained it deeper than the opening government.
Exactly. Exactly. What do you see? So the second way to compare arguments is basically just to filter out the assumptions, and that's even easier to do, because that means if the speech, or if the second team starts exactly at the assumption of the team before, you will have an easy time to see whether they proved that this assumption would actually fall on their side or the other way around. For example, we had this in this debate. Like the corporate thing is a very good explanation. It's a very good example. Opening government comes up and talks about corporations and having bad incentives, but the opening opposition just explains better why this is not the case. They just win because they have the better assumptions on their side. It's just way more credible that corporations will want to appeal to people than that they are inherently bad. It's way more pragmatic. A lot more people will agree with the assumption of opening opposition. And it works very well in terms of the objectification point we have in the second 2 speeches. You might have noticed if you read through everything. If you didn't, you would actually need to read the whole speech. It doesn't make much sense. But the deputy prime minister talks a lot about objectification, and she says, well, we need to ban those advertisements because objectification is bad. That's what she says. And for the opening opposition, the deputy leader of the opposition then says as well, no, goes directly into that assumption and proves, well, objectification is not bad in every single case, because it's just a normal thing that people experience sexual arousal on terms of the human body. And actually, the assumption that it's kind of normal that people find each other attractive, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, is in that debate, we will need the second half for that to have the challenged. But in the first half, it's just it's more basic than just taking this entire term of objectification and putting out that's bad, right?
Yeah, but there's I'm sorry, but there's a difference between that and without wanting to get into the
Yes, there's a big difference, and it's not being, but the thing is, it's not being explained in opening government, and you will notice that this clash is actually won by closing government, which explains it a lot better. So we just take the first two halves. If you just take the term objectification without explaining what it means, it's something that's not very credible, right?
Yeah, but then if you explain it wrong, it's also not very credible. It's not desire of the human body. That's not credible either.
Exactly, and that's what happens in the second half. And that's why I picked that example, because if you watch that entire debate, you will notice that might be falling on the opposition side in the first half. And then these assumptions here of opening opposition, they're teared down in the second half. They're really they're pretty much destroyed by closing government. And the entire objectification point falls on the closing government side. I told you this. If you have the time to watch the speeches and go through, I don't have transcripts of them because they're talking way too fast. And with way too fast, I mean, even for my
Faster than 1,500 words?
yes, I guess so. I don't know. Really, really fast. But they go even deeper, to go a lot deeper, explain things a lot better, and just steal that point. But that's you will notice that if you see the speeches, it's very, very easy to see. Also, what we notice. Oh, that's it. I don't need those places because they're nonsense. But what we notice, sometimes we will have a judgment call in terms of the assumptions. Objectification is a perfect example because different people will understand different things out of objectification. And the judges will just end up discussing what did they actually mean if it's not further explained. So that team that explains it the best will win. And, well, otherwise, yeah, you just go for the team that explains it the best. That's about it. That was my workshop.